Okay, I think we're live. Good morning, everyone. I know we're 15 minutes later than usual. It's because, as you can see, we're all in different places this week. The church is closed. So we have some people in Philadelphia, some in, Kathy left, but she's in California, and I'm in Boston right now. We just wanted to say Merry Christmas to everyone. But this week, we're going to talk about two recent articles, one in the New York Times on the United Methodist Church, and then the other in the Financial Times about the Unitarian Universalist Church, and what's been happening in them and various splits and what that says about Christianity in America and its undoing in the light of Martin Luther King Jr. and James Baldwin. And so without further ado, I'll hand it over to Doc, who will talk about those articles. And they're linked in the video description, so you should be able to read them.
Yes, good morning, everybody, and I hope everybody's enjoying their holidays. So many of the free school people are all over the world in different places, and we miss them, and I'm certain they miss us. I mean, even if they're in California, it's not Philly. You know, I have to say this if you don't mind. You know, California, sunny and warm and beautiful, and Philly, not so beautiful, not so sunny, kind of gritty and dirty, but we got all the creativity, the music, the art, and of course the free school. So we can't wait for all of the members of the free school to get back here, and and we're meeting online again because the Unitarian Church is closed for the holidays, and we'll be meeting online next week as well, I think. So anyway, this week we want to talk about the crisis in Christianity, American Christianity, and suggest some articles written by James Baldwin, and also to talk about the importance of this crisis to the democratic and revolutionary reconstitution of the American polity, the American political system. Of course, all of this occurs as we enter into the year of probably the most consequential election in American history. Everything is pretty much at stake or up for grabs. As I, talk to Nanditha and Raju and Purba, and really to Sambarta's parents, whom I hope to talk to more this coming weekend. Really, I do. This crisis is unfathomable. They can't get their heads around it. If you are not here, it's just incomprehensible that the most powerful nation, a nation which has been the most powerful nation in the world for over 75 years, is now in a crisis of decline and facing an election like the 2024 election. People just don't get it. And that's understandable. They have no references. But I think even more than that, and this goes for, again, we have to reference the American left, which is like a soldier that has been in many battles and has lost a leg and an arm and an eye and is barely limping along, but trying to convince everybody that he's still able to enter into new battles. But everybody knows that he is not. That's kind of what the American left looks like. They cannot comprehend this profound fragmentation of the country. And we've gone through this so often. Perhaps I'm talking a little bit more because I'm talking to Emily's parents who are listening to us. We're in new territory. Part of the problem of the American progressives and American left is that they act like they never heard of James Baldwin, who offers a most profound investigation of the very problems that we will be addressing today. I'll kind of give some essays, and I want to really thank Emily for sharing some essays with me last evening, which will, I think, help us to look at this problem in a larger and, in fact, more accurate, more concrete way. Well, in the past 2 weeks, important articles have appeared in both the Financial Times and the New York Times on the breakup of what are called mainline denominations. Just let me explain something about Christianity and Protestantism. Christianity on a global scale is much larger than Protestantism. The largest Christian denominations are the Catholic Church, which is centered, or its headquarters is in the Vatican in Rome, and is headed by the Pope. There is also the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is split into several denominations, the Russian Orthodox and the Ukrainian Orthodox. And then there is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. But those are not as large as the Catholic Church. But the United States and U.S. Christianity was born out of what is known as the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, and what we could say traces its roots back to a single event, which was Martin Luther, the Catholic bishop, who in around 1515, I think, I hope I have it right, posted on the main cathedral of a church in a German city these lists of demands. And this was a protest against the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, which could have gotten him sentenced to death. But the word Protestantism comes from protest. The other thing is the Protestant religions or denominations emerge in the period of the rise of capitalism and the decline of feudalism. In this sense, then, American Christianity is quintessentially modern and capitalist, with all of the values of capitalism, including individualism, the rights of the individual, the separation of the church from the state, and so on. So American Christianity arises out of a revolution, and a long revolution, including many bloody wars and civil wars, which often took on the form of peasant wars against landlords and against the aristocracy. This Protestant Reformation culminates in the French and American revolutions, the high point of the Protestant struggle. And therefore, when we talk about the early immigrants and the so-called founding fathers and the so-called pilgrims to the United States, they were fleeing the oppression and so on in Europe that emerged from these wars of religion, which are in essence wars of ideology. It's quite fascinating when you think about it. For example, if you take the Quaker movement or the Amish movement, we're very familiar with Amish people here in Philadelphia, and we're familiar with Quakers, the community of friends, as they call themselves. They were revolutionaries who were defeated on the battlefield in the struggles against the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. And so they fled to the United States. And in fact, the first anti-slavery protests in the United States were held here in Philadelphia, led by the Quakers. And they're called Quakers because ritualistically, they did not adhere to the strict rituals of the Catholic Church. If you've ever been to a Catholic church, it's very scripted. You know, Quakerism was more the individual expressing his or her relationship to God. And so it was that America is a Christian country, but a Protestant country. It's not Christian in the way, let us say, that Italy is, or France is. And so the revolutions against the Catholic Church were part of the founding of America and of the American Revolution. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say that. So when it is said, as it is said, that America is a Christian nation, it is pretty much saying America is a Protestant nation with Catholics, but it is a Protestant nation. The deep structure, the values of the nation, the architecture of the civilization is grounded in the values of the Protestant Reformation that began in Europe and in many ways was fulfilled in the United States. And there are what we call Protestant denominations. For those who don't know, unlike the Catholic Church where you have one church, or even in Islam where they talk about the Ummah, the community of over 1 billion people, in Protestantism, you have individual churches who come together in a denomination. Oh, hey man, take your coats off, sit down.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for having us.
Hey, look, sorry we didn't let you know about the church. Sit down. Oh, the people from Jewish Voices with these?
We're Jewish, but not with Jewish voices.
Were y'all a what?
We're just saying we're Jewish, but not with
Oh,
Jewish
okay, well, that's
voices.
good.
We're fans of your work.
Oh, cool. Wow.
We actually found you from Midwestern Marks.
Oh, stop the madness.
Yeah.
Hey, sit down. We're just starting. We're talking about Protestantism and the Protestant Reformation and how. Well, come on, sit down. You'll hear it. Yeah.
Okay.
Make yourselves at home.
Hi, everyone.
This is a house where I grew I'll tell you about it.
Yeah.
What is your name?
Gannon.
Gannon, what is your
Ryan.
My pleasure. Such a pleasure. Welcome here.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes. So the American nation state, the American civilization, is I don't want to use the word determined, is framed civilizationally in Christianity. And even Catholicism is in the United States is different than in, let us say, Italy or Austria or France, because it is conditioned by the civilization in this country. So the mainline denominations, that is, those churches that fall under a certain hierarchy, a certain set of ways of doing things, I'll put it that way. There's 7 of them, and they're known as the Mainline because they are the richest and most powerful Protestant denominations. I don't know, am I making sense? I'm trying to explain this because, okay, denominations. Now, but there are other Protestant denominations that do not fall under the mainline denominations. In other words, if you take Southern Baptists, they don't fall under what are called mainline. If you take, for example, evangelicals or even Pentecostalists, or if you take that whole group of Black denominations, such as the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the National Baptist Convention, they don't fall under the mainstream denominations. You see what I'm saying? But yet, for example, and if I'm not being clear, just tell me to stop and I'll try to explain. For example, the African Methodist Episcopal Church is the first Black denomination in the Western world, maybe outside of Ethiopia, in the world. It is Black people, free Black people, in the late 1700s, refusing to accept a discriminatory practice within Methodism here in Philadelphia, and they left. And one group formed a new denomination known as African Methodist Episcopals, and they were bringing together 2 denominations, so to speak, Methodism and Episcopalianism, and then wrapping it in an African civilization and cultural imaginary. I'll put it that way. And so today, when we interact here in Philly with the AME Church, with Mother Bethel is the mother church, the founding church of the denomination. That denomination split and formed an offshoot known as the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Paul Robeson's brother was a pastor in that church, and a church in Harlem where Paul Robeson himself was funeralized. But then the most popular and largest body of Protestants in the Black community and of Black Christians are Baptists. Now, because the Baptist denomination starts in the South, I think, and they're known as Southern Baptists, and they're all white. And their theology was always racist, pro-slavery. Black people form the National Baptist Convention. And these are voluntary associations, I should say, where individual churches, and you go around Philadelphia, you see all of these Black Baptist churches. You'll see the First Baptist Church, and you'll see the First African Baptist Church, and all of that. It's so fascinating. And each of them is a self-defined, self-supporting congregation or community that agrees to align with the National Baptist Convention. You see, and so the largest group of Black Christians are Baptists, and the largest denomination of Black Baptists fall under the National Baptist Convention. If I could just say one small thing here. Martin Luther King, when the civil rights movement was starting in Montgomery, and there were all hierarchies and structures have a very strong conservatism. And when King and the members of SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, very interesting. The name is not insignificant. Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They formed as a result of having been kicked out of the National Baptist Convention, who said that you rebels are trying to take over in the name of a social revolution, and you're not paying attention to the Bible. And you said, I said how interesting. So King and them, these young rebels, formed their own movement within the Baptist Church. And remember, King is a Baptist minister. His father was a Baptist minister. His grandfather, they were all Baptists, because that's the kind of the denomination or the religious theological movement that enslaved Africans and after slavery were, how would you say, recruited to, because most of the slave owners and most of the South were Baptists. Methodism, and this is very interesting, which comes out of England. The word Methodist comes from the word method. I guess you heard of the rapper Method Man. No connection. Never heard of Method Man? Okay, look him up. But anyway, but Methodism, from very, very organic, very simple reasons, the method of prayer, the method of worship. Quakers, we quake. We, do crazy stuff, which the Catholic Church would never permit. But Methodism was the first, I won't say first because the Quakers, but one of the first Protestant denominations to oppose slavery in England. Many Black people, especially in the North, even during slavery, were attracted to Methodism because of its anti-slavery stance. And John Wesley, and there's the college in New England called Wesleyan. It's a Methodist college, you see. So I say all of that to, just to give a sense of the deep and broad and historical and civilizational dimensions of this. And you cannot trivialize any of this, because this constitutes the life world of the American people. And I'm certain, I know I'll take like Emily or Alice, your parents come to this country, and I'm certain they're still trying to figure this out. All of these, it's non-hierarchical. I'm certain some Barton, I hope to talk to your parents about this. It does not compute so easily, but it is the deep and long tradition of individualism and the revolution against aristocracy and hierarchy. And that's what you have here. So these, again, let me get back to the mainline denominations. They are Methodism, Episcopalianism, Lutheranism, Presbyterianism, and I forget the last two or three. But if you look it up, do a Wikipedia. These are what are known as the mainline denominations. They are kind of what one would consider the foundation of American Protestantism and Christianity. They have the colleges, the universities, the theological seminaries, and they constitute for American Christianity what the Vatican and the Catholic Church and Catholic universities are for Catholicism. Now, everybody else are not considered mainline, but I say that to only get to this point, that a crisis of legitimacy within the mainline denominations can be considered or viewed as part of the crisis of legitimacy of the political system itself, especially at the level of elites. For example, take Unitarian Universalists, a very small part of the American population and of American Protestantism, but far more important in their ideological and theological definitions of the Christian or Protestant religion. Episcopalianism, very small, nowhere near the size of, let us say, the Southern Baptist denomination, but very influential. Influential because you take Methodism, the Methodist denomination, so many presidents, Supreme Court justices, and so on come from those, from the Methodists. Now, the two articles I think that are included in the email that we sent out, and they're worth reading. The first is from the Financial Times, and it's interesting. The Financial Times writes an article about a crisis in an American denomination. Unitarianism is a uniquely American denomination. I think founded in somewhere in the 1700s. The Unitarian Church has given the movements against slavery and racial discrimination some of its best fighters and warriors. Martin Luther King was fond of quoting this from a Unitarian preacher: "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends to justice." You've heard that. Well, King was quoting the Unitarian pastor Theodore Parker. The Unitarian Church from its beginnings were anti-slavery. Martin Luther King first heard about Gandhi and the Indian movement and Soul Force and so on from Hinduism and the Indian independence movement, from the president, the black president of Howard University, Mordecai Johnson, at the first Unitarian Universalist Church in downtown Philadelphia, in fact, where we meet these days. King himself gave a sermon entitled Three Dimensions of a Complete Life at the Unitarian Church up on Lincoln Drive in Germantown in Philadelphia. Two of the great martyrs of the civil rights movement, James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo, were Unitarian Universalists. Both were killed in the fight against segregation. So this church has always been anti-slavery. The Episcopal Church has not ever been anti-colonial or anti-slavery until it was all over, and then they say, oh, we apologize, and now we're anti-slavery and anti-colonial. Well, you're 100 years late, but we accept the apology. Never been that. And if you study the practices of the two, and of course we have because of our interactions with them, there is a difference. There is a difference. However, the Unitarian Universalist Church, which is very progressive in the social progressive sense, and by that we're talking about the postmodern period. By postmodern, we mean this period of ideas and ideology and philosophy, which kind of rejects the movements of the past, i.e., the communist, the socialist, the anti-colonial, and all of the theories that go with that, and would argue that the spearhead of the struggle are cultural issues such as gender, sexuality, a kind of way of identifying race separate from the political economy and so on. A kind of individualist, identity affirming project. Let me just give you an example. Gay, I'll take the Black community. Gayness is not new in the Black life world. Black people tend to be less anti-gay than white people. They really do. Because all of us were segregated and remain so, where would you isolate your gay daughter or son or nephew or cousin? Because we all have to live in a prescribed community. So gay and straight and trans, whatever you want to call yourself, we all live together. And unfortunately, with all of the claims and counterclaims, there is no oral or other histories of, I don't think, of living as a gay person or whatever in the Black community. The closest we come to it in narrative and fictional terms is James Baldwin. And in the modern, postmodern, quote, gay LGBTQ, Baldwin is not embraced or only embraced in certain limited ways.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? Because he felt that the, quote, gay movement was really a white movement. And he says it, and we can get into that. But the other thing is, I have to say, there is not yet a scholarship worthy of the great James Baldwin. In academy or whatever, there is not. I think, well, I'll stop there. I don't want to say too much. But in the white world, especially in mainline Protestantism, the rules, the grammar of the life world is more strict. And thus, to be white is to adhere to the common values of the white world. Black folk, you ain't gonna be white no kind of way unless you light enough to pass for white. And then if somebody find you out, then that game is up. But anyway, that's a whole nother story. There's a whole practice used to be called passing for white. You know what I'm saying? White by day on your job, black by night when you come home to your community and your family. But that's another story. The white world has, over this history, been strictly organized around a single concept, which itself is a fiction, called whiteness. Whiteness is a negative. It is not a positive identity. And hence its fragility. And in a crisis, whiteness does not carry the predictive outcomes and possibilities it did, let us say, 50 years ago. To be white meant you could live in a better neighborhood, meant your kids could go to college, meant that you had a better job, etc. If you were white. But in a crisis like this one, whiteness does not carry that same power. And I dare say, immigrants who come to this country, highly educated, I'm not talking about the poor people, but let us say from Asia, South Asia, East Asia. Educate my children, and Asians do that to the max, I'm finding out more and more, for the purpose of joining the white world. And in many ways, second, even third generations of immigrants can outdo white people in whiteness, which is a spectacle that's interesting to observe, I mean, from the black standpoint. But anyway, but if whiteness doesn't predict success, then for white people and for immigrants at the level of higher education and so on, then what value does it have? Okay, does that all make sense? So much of American civilization is the Protestant Revolution, the rise of the individual, all of the positive things, the separation of church and state, the supremacy of law, we're all equal under the law. This is all wonderful stuff and revolutionary and not to be trivialized in and of itself. However, it could not resolve what became the central problem of Western and certainly of American civilization, and that is the problem of race and slavery. This is the ghost forever haunting the American mind. And of course, this is why Baldwin becomes this, unbelievable figure. Unbelievable figure, because he interrogates, deconstructs, and exposes the consequences and the short lifespan of this identity known as whiteness. That's why Baldwin comes off a bit as apocalyptic. But he is saying this cannot last. And so American Protestantism, founded in revolution, is forever haunted by its connection to slavery and racism. Now, two mainline, by the way, I'm saying mainline and not mainstream. Mainline is a different thing. Mainline Protestant denominations are splitting apart. Let's start with the Unitarian Universalist. The articles, both of them say that what triggered the splits, are the LGBTQ questions. And my first reaction is that is not even the main part of the crisis. LGBTQ is not an issue for Unitarian Universalists. Everybody accepts gay marriage, LGBTQ, identity, the rights of LGBTQ, etc. Everybody in the Unitarian Church. But what is the split about? And I have concluded that the split has to do with a more profound civilizational crisis. And the question of what is the future for American civilization? And what will American civilization look like? And who will decide that? Now, this is the question of the people versus elites. These denominations in the last 40 years, maybe a little longer, have been taken over, let's say the Unitarians, by highly educated, university educated elites. If you are not comfortable with their leadership, well, you leave the Unitarians and either become an individual person who lives by certain spiritual values and his or her own interpretations and so on, or maybe you go to an evangelical church, or maybe you try to join a Black church, or maybe you go to Islam, or maybe you become a Buddhist. But if you are not comfortable, whatever your views on any other cultural issues are, with a highly educated elite, sometimes what we call the, what do we call it? The
Professional managerial.
Professional managerial class. If you're not comfortable with them telling you how to live and what you should believe and what the future is, or even if you feel that you guys have failed and you're talking shit that somebody taught you at Yale University, and we're not interested in that, and we're seeking, let us say, a deeper spiritual connection to humanity, what Martin Luther King called a cosmic companionship. You see what I'm saying? You can't, it's these two class and ideological orientations are irreconcilable. So that's where I see the Unitarian Church, which is really a small church. I think overall there are about 1.5, 1.6 Unitarians in the United States, although its footprint in progressive Christianity is very large. But then there's Methodism. It is the largest mainline denomination. It's not the largest denomination among Protestants, the largest mainline. Its split is far more significant. And because it is more associated with mainstream American values, overdetermined by the elite presence in Methodism. Methodism has its colleges, its theological seminaries, its theologians, and so on. They have regular conventions. They decide upon theological issues based upon these conventions and long and democratic discussions. I would say discussions overdetermined by elites. Now, Methodism is a global movement. If you go to what they call the global south, let us say Africa, Methodists in Africa do not carry the same values, especially around sexuality, gender, family, and those types of things. They don't. They go in a different direction. For them, the anti-colonial struggle is the backdrop. John Wesley, Wilberforce, the anti-slavery, anti-colonial struggles that are the early Methodists. So they are not down with postmodern culture and values in their church. And they are not going to be dictated by primarily white elites from the United States or England. They're not going to do it. And so they will go their own way. The same with the Episcopal Church. And all of these Protestant denominations, while they're declining in the United States and the West, they're growing in Africa. So you take the Episcopal Church, let us say in Uganda or Nigeria or South Africa. They have said over the last 20 years that they do not want the cultural values of the American Episcopal Diocese. And they have threatened time and again to split off and go their own way. And so while Episcopalianism shrinks dramatically in the United States, it grows in Africa, but on Africa's terms, and they won't be dictated by Westerners. Now, I just want to bring this to an end and then say a little bit about Baldwin on this question. I am viewing the breakup of these mainline Protestant denominations with the larger crisis of legitimacy. Now, crises of legitimacy are generally articulated as political crises. And that's the way we in the Free School have talked about this. It's a crisis of legitimacy, bourgeois political scientists framing of a problem of a crisis that Lenin called the ruling class can't rule in the old way, and the people don't want them to rule them anymore. That's, the same thing, different language, a little bit different clothing. We're faced with that in the United States. Crises of legitimacy in bourgeois political context are manifestations of the fact, and this is from the poem, The Second Coming, which I think we should all read all the time, by, I'll remember in a second.
Yates.
Yates. Yeah, William Russell, William Russell, Yates. Where he says, the center will not hold. Things fall apart. And so we have this in the the center has not held. And thus, can the ruling class govern if they cannot bring all sides or most sides of the ruling elite together and under their leadership, the broad masses together with this idea of, well, we had an election and now we'd be pragmatic and deal with the domestic and foreign policy, yada, 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 you know. But when the center has not held and two sides at basic war with one another, and the thing that is so fascinating here in the United States is that the two sides, although not fully crystallized, are defined on the basis of the classes that make them up. Mm. On the side of the Trump movement, and I'm not talking about the Republican Party, the Trump movement, which, among other things, is struggling to take over the Republican Party. The Trump movement, which has an anti-war wing, and we have to acknowledge that, and so on. It is the more working class of the two sides. The white working class has completely left the Democratic Party, and Black workers are on their way to doing the same thing, which will undo the Democratic Party because Blacks are the most solid, reliable base of the Democratic Party. I've estimated that close to 40% of Black men in this election will either vote for Trump or refuse to vote at all as a conscious protest. Both of them are protest votes. The other side, the Democratic Party, when you do the numbers and the demographics, is the richest party, the most wealthy party, and made up of the richest, most wealthiest people in history. There's never been a party since modern political parties have come into existence that is such a party of wealth and frankly of war and austerity. So you got these two sides. In some ways, although not in perfect form, and I want to say this, you know, the left is always looking for some perfect manifestation. Oh, that's not the class struggle. Well, the class struggle takes a lot of forms and has many stages in its development. The class struggle in this moment might not look like the class struggle will look, let us say, in 5 years from now or a year from now. You know, interestingly, if this Colorado Supreme Court decision is allowed to go forward, and they tried in other places, you know, and they're going to keep Trump off the ballot under some bogus interpretation of the 14th Amendment. Right. Well, you're stoking violence. Not that Trump has to call for, but try to keep him off the ballot and see what people do, because it will be not in defense of Trump, but in their anger at a ruling elite that would do something like this. It's the same dynamic politically and social psychologically that we see with the breakup of these denominations. I would argue that to the extent that they're working class and like lower middle class, non-elite elements, let's say in the Unitarian Church and in the Methodist Church, they have found it increasingly unacceptable to be ruled by elites, university trained, etc. And we see this kind of in our own interactions with the Unitarians, college professors, doctors, and so on and so forth, lawyers, professionals. The same thing. The center will not hold. In Methodism, the center has collapsed. In the Unitarian, the center could not hold. In other words, after years and years of compromise, of discourse, of consensus building, you reach a point where compromise is no longer possible. Like in a marriage where marriage is compromise all the time. We won't get into that. But at some point, you can't talk to each other. You don't hear each other. You cannot compromise. Well, it's the same thing with these denominations. The compromise is no longer possible. And we have to go our separate ways. Now, Baldwin, no one that I know of, scholars on Christianity, Protestantism, I don't think have brought to bear the deep insights of Baldwin. And I'm only repeating him when I say that Christianity is what frames American civilization. It is not in and of itself American civilization, because American civilization consists of its political institutions, its cultural institutions, so on. But I think the architecture of American civilization, of the deep values of Americans, of what Americans aspire to, at least what they say they aspire to, those values are to be found in American Protestantism. Okay? But like Baldwin points out, the contradiction is what is proclaimed and what is we say we aspire to and how we live.
Yeah.
And if there's nothing else about Baldwin, his studies of how the American people live, and that contradiction of what we say and what we do.
Yep.
And of course, then the question of what we do with Black folk. And he is right. Baldwin is right. That unresolved contradiction has brought us to where we are now. Now, Black Christianity ain't doing that good either. I think for somewhat different reasons. I think the church, which about 40 or 50 years ago, the Black churches went, and they said it's such a joke to think about it, went to a business model, rather than a values model where everything becomes transactional. And we've experienced that. We won't go into the details. That it's all about the money. And what the Black churches were saying, look at these white churches in the suburbs. They're doing good because they have a business model. Well, first of all, hometown, you ain't white and you're not in the suburbs. And that's not your tradition. So the business model was your worst move. You know what I'm saying? And so the further the Black church got into the business model, and then they went to mega churches and TD Jakes and this one and the other one, and and all that, and you know, and they had good music. I mean, if you wanted to go to a free concert every Sunday, go to some of these mega churches. They sing the shit out of this, you know, Patti LaBelle type singing. They just have religious lyrics, you know. And that's where they kept people, you know, great music. Then they brought in, they even, you know, like it was a split between, you know, gospel, traditional gospel, which also was a split off from the traditional sorrow songs and Negro spirituals, and then went to gospel, and then got into the 60s and 70s, they went into rhythm and blues. I mean, it was unusual. I don't ever remember going to a church and seeing a band with electric guitars, electric bass, drums, and all. I mean, it'd just be throwing down. I mean, that was one thing that kept a lot of people coming to church as well. As, you know, you can get dressed up, and if you're looking for a partner, you know, all the handsome men, all the beautiful women are all dressed up and sexy and shit. And you know, a lot of churches became fashion shows. It was, but that's Black life. You know, if you want, some Black exploitation films have explored this in a comedic way, and it is comedy. But they went to the business model, and going to the business model meant that they also went to the politicians. And they also became, rather than critics of the state and its policies of discrimination, and so on, of gentrification and all of this, they became allies of it, in spite of the fact that their congregations, or what remained of their congregations, were becoming poorer and poorer. And so you only had the baby boomers and older people in walkers and shit and wheelchairs coming to church. No, yeah, and they were comfortable with this, you know. I mean, and so they would survive often based upon their relationships with the government. For example, giving out free food. Another thing is having your church be a voting site. You know what I'm saying? Employing your members on election day. But the very essence of Black Christianity, which was protest, like Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism, it was protest. And one of the interesting things, you know, Martin Luther King, that wasn't his original name. His original name was Michael King Jr., and his father was Michael King Sr. His father went over to Germany for some kind of conference, religious conference, and he learned about Martin Luther. And that's when he changed his name to Martin Luther King Sr., and Michael King Jr. was named Martin Luther King Jr. That's how seriously they took protest. The Black church is not the Black church if it is not grounded in protest. And this, here we go, business model, which is, I'll put it another way, a bullshit model, an anti-Black Christianity model, an entertainment model, a transaction, even your relationship. A person could have been a member of your church all of their lives and they die. And the family comes and say, well, we'd like to have the funeral here. And the preacher, the secretary of the church says, well, here's what it will cost you. He said, well, but my mother paid into the church for 50 years. And so we can't, you know. And therefore, you get more Black people having their funerals in funeral homes rather than in churches. So the business model has eviscerated the soul of Black Christianity. And so Black people leave the church. But now black people, unlike white people, have options. We have religious options that white people don't have. It's so interesting. White people are lost, as they say, lost in the sauce, lost in the wilderness, because they're so bound to mainstream or mainline white denominations. And the operative problematic is white, which gets us back to Baldwin. Hang on to that fiction, you will decline internally, externally. But anyway, black people have options. One of the big options is the Nation of Islam or Islam itself. In Philadelphia, 40% of black people or more identify as Muslims. You go around Philadelphia, you get black people all over Philadelphia with Muslim names. Jamal, Samir, Abdul. But it's like Abdul Harris.
Right.
It's not like a Muslim name all the way down the line. It's Abdul Johnson. You see what I'm saying? But if the Christian church don't do what we needed to do, we will go to the Nation of Islam, or we will find a masjid, black people. Because, our Islam is from Turkey, is from Pakistan, is from Saudi Arabia. It's our own thing as we invented. So we can sometimes it's called the mosque. Other times it's a masjid. And because black people have that flair for the poetic, masjid, I'm going to the masjid. It has that kind of swag to it. Or you can be a 5% Muslim, a follower of Clarence 13X. Or you can go mainstream and try to go into a regular mosque, a South Asian mosque, a Sudanese mosque, you know what I'm saying? Or your mosque could be called a temple. But anyway, we have that option. The other option, and so the Muslims will say, see, we told y'all you should never have followed the white man's religion. Right. That's a slave religion. So come on over here where you belong anyway. Right. That's the way black people can talk and think. Very interesting. White people don't have that option. They shut themselves off from all of this. You don't want to be Muslim. You don't want to be nothing but white. So be that until the wheels come off. Right. Like they say, I'm going to ride this white thing out and see where it takes me. Well, it then drove you into a brick wall. Now what you going to do? Well, Baldwin's option, give up whiteness. Become the last white nation. But anyway, but then black people have another option. African spirituality. Akan, Yoruba, all different, however we want to, or we can synthesize. We could be a Yoruba and an Akan. It's a beautiful thing to see, man. And then if that ain't good enough, you can do like a lot of jazz musicians. I become a Buddhist, and I chant Buddhism, the Buddhist prayer. And if that ain't enough, you can do like Alice and John Coltrane did. I'll become a Hindu. Because, see, black people are not inhibited by whiteness. The world has all of these possibilities. We don't have to go Christian or white. We can go any of these things. And this is why the crisis of black Christianity, and it isn't a crisis, has not closed off the possibilities of religion and spirituality. And like Farrakhan says, and if you go to the Nation of Islam, you can see it, they are better Christians than the Christians. They even say we're better Jews than the Jews. So Black thing is just so fascinating. But anyway, what is the answer for the American people, for whom religion and Christianity, Protestantism in particular, has failed them? It is to return to the roots of the Third American Revolution on the pathway to the next American Revolution, and that is Martin Luther King. That theology holds up better than any theological framing, in some ways superseding Martin Luther. King was both rationalist theology, Paul Tillich, Reinhold Niebuhr, and the spiritualism of the African. King's interrogations of time, his idea of a cosmic companionship. You can go to West Africa among the Dogon people, and that will resonate, that idea of a cosmic companionship, an infinitude beyond time. Well, King protested the church being taken over for monetary and material reasons. So it will be King, and it will be Baldwin. This is a deep crisis. Unless you understand this country and its people, you can't understand this crisis. If you have a point of view that says that religion is the opiate of the people rather than the cry of the people for something more, if you see religion in its Protestant American form as not aspirational, but as a negative response, if that's all you see, you'll never understand the American people. If you want to reduce, as most, and I put quotes here, mechanistic materialist and mechanistic Marxists do, that's trivial, that's unimportant. Those values are the result of a people who are not class conscious and all of that shit. If that's the way you want to do it, well, you will be the recipients of the utter contempt of the people. People respect their moral and spiritual and religious values, no matter what we think of them. So we're on the cusp of something very new. Possibilities abound. And I would just like to suggest 3 articles, 2 of which I got, and I really want to thank Emily for this. And they're in the text, The Cross of Redemption, Uncollected Writings of James Baldwin. And it's so interesting that they're still uncollected writings of James Baldwin. The first essay is We Can Change the Country. The other is, and I think this may have been his last written essay. This is not. Wait, hold on 1 minute. what is it, Emily? It's called To Crush the Serpent,
To Crush
right?
the Serpent.
Yeah, To Crush the Serpent, which was his last essay. And, To Crush the Serpent. And
On Being White and Other Lies?
yes, was it On Being White?
On Being White and Other Lies.
Yeah, I guess, and On Being White and Other Lies. I would suggest that Baldwin is a great American revolutionary theorist, that no American revolutionary who is really honest about what we're trying to do can go forward without Baldwin. So I'll stop there.
Well, I thought that there's a lot in there, Doc, because as you kind of implied, I didn't grow up in a religious family at all. And so when I first read Baldwin in college, I used to think that Baldwin talked a lot about America being a Christian nation because he was a Christian or came from the church. But then as I grew older, and especially because of free school and also realizing that Martin Luther King Jr. was not just a preacher, but actually that it was significant that he comes from Christianity to speak to the people, like that the people respond to him because there's a deep moral voice inside of him that the people need and look for, and that's how they already live. I realized that, like, especially reading his essays recently is when and also his novels, like we're reading Go Tell It on the Mountain, the more you realize, like you said it, you framed it best, which is that America is already framed by Christianity. And for some reason, there's also something really interesting that, because I think it's true, like even when you were listing, like the way we educate, higher education, most of it is actually both explicitly comes from certain, I guess, Christian denomination. I'm still getting used to the terms, but like denominations, but also even if I think a lot of higher education and the way we basically educate on that higher level is totally architecturally or influenced by Christianity, I think. And so like even that is interesting, but I don't know. There's something interesting about what you said, that the Christianity in America.
May I just interrupt you? Just, I would say by the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah, that's what I was going to
Because
say.
Christianity is also Catholicism.
Oh, okay.
So I just wanted to say, and the Protestant Reformation, which was a rebellion, a revolution against Catholicism in its older form, not the way it is today, because it is, I think, because of the modern world and the values of modernity, Catholicism has been deeply transformed, especially in the United States, by the Protestant Reformation.
No, that was important because
I
that's
didn't
what
mean to interrupt you. Sorry.
No, that was important because that's what I'm like my whole life. I basically felt like it was all very confusing. Like because I was, like you said, like my parents to this day don't understand Christianity. Like there's so many, and I'm looking at my mom, but she was like listening the whole time too, where it's like there's so many Protestant. What's the difference between Protestant and Presbyterian and Methodist? And okay, and then you don't even go into the Quakers and the Unitarians and the, like, it's just so much. And I'm like, I need someone to make a tree or something, but like I need like a visual map. But the thing is that like I never spent the time thinking about it, but the more well, basically the more I've grown up and the more I've become concerned about the American people and also the future, is I always felt like I became much more spiritual and religious, but it's not just because I like religion, but it's because it brings you closer to your people. Because it is true. I think it's true that I think it's funny because America is very much like has been influenced by Protestantism, which is a protest against Catholicism. Yet, like you said, in America over the years, there becomes like this religion that is built based on protest has this ghost of a central contradiction or a ghost of a central concern of its own people, which is slavery and racism, and something that continues to this day. And so that's why it's also interesting, because in the articles it's framed as a culture wars thing about like LGBTQ plus, but actually it's the same ghost. It's like, you know what I mean? It's not really it's not a new issue of LGBTQ plus issues splitting the churches. It's really the same ghost that has not been confronted by white people, essentially. And actually it's a ghost that has become more and more present because of the crisis in America, that now these people can feel and have to face, but in some ways don't have a language to talk about it because they've ignored King and they don't read Baldwin. And yeah, or like, I don't know, that was really interesting to me. Or like, it's pretty deep because, there's something else I'm gonna say. Yeah, I also just wanted to underline what you said, Doc, that like, I feel like people, like, especially if you are on the left, and like, if you're on the left, but even a whole young generation who is looking for an alternative worldview, and you're encouraged to denounce religion or to say like basically fuck Christianity, like, but also all kinds of religion, rather than understanding, like you said, that religion is a cry of the people rather than being an opiate of the people. Like this very distinct the roots of America are based in Protestantism, like a people who left Europe as a protest. It's not just about religion, it's about ideology. And because I also think it's a misconstrual of the American Revolution as well. If that makes, like, I think people also make the original American Revolution of 1776 or the birth of America very much about like however they define political versus understanding in some ways even the strivings of the people who we call the founding fathers, or like the strivings of that revolution. And because I'm also trying to figure out why it is that, like, another reason why people, for example, don't want to accept Martin Luther King Jr. as a revolutionary, or the civil rights movement or the Black freedom struggle as revolutionary, like basically equivalent to 1776 or equivalent to the Second American Revolution, which we call like Reconstruction. And yeah, and I also want to just agree with you on Baldwin, because I think it's not like, because we've talked about this in our reading group, but Baldwin always says, I left the church, but I took the church with me. And he says, like, you know, where he says basically that I didn't leave the church as in leave my people, like I brought the church with me. And that keeps me like, and I think in some ways the way Baldwin, he says this thing where he says, like, he makes the point to always say, America is a Christian nation that needs to regain the right to call itself Christian. Like, you know, and he's not denouncing religion. He's saying that actually it's in some ways it's a political and spiritual edge of the people. That in some ways it's a very important edge to say that a people who are Christian for a reason, that they need to regain the right to like worship the Prince of Peace, which means to become the last white nation. Like, I feel like that's very important. Yeah, I guess I'll just say that.
Yeah, there's yeah, I'm also thinking about a lot of stuff, and I feel like because I was raised Christian, it's like you have some window into it, but there's also so much you don't know. And I feel like in some ways, like I operate from a very particular point of view in relation to all this stuff. And I think one thing that I did was thinking about as Doc was speaking and as Emily was speaking was, to my understanding, part of the kind of organizing principle of the Protestant Reformation was this idea that what the Catholic Church kind of represented at the time was this idea that the individual believer, like the ordinary person, could only access God mediated through the church. And the Protestant Reformation is this idea that each believer can access God unmediated and have a direct relationship with God. And the great irony of that historical development is that now basically all of the Protestant churches, like whether it's mainline or otherwise, except for, I guess, yeah, kind of like the smaller, like less conventional churches, they're all basically organized in terms of hierarchy and structure. And it's kind of like you've become, in some ways, the thing that you initially rebelled against. And yeah, I just feel like that's very interesting because, like, in part, like, so my family basically, we came to America as Christians, and in part that's because I think of the legacy of missionaries in Korea, and so a lot of the people who left Korea, like oftentimes were either already Christian, and specifically in my case it's Presbyterian, or they became Christian, especially after coming to the West, into the United States. But it's a very interesting development because it's like, I don't know how much to read into like my own family's background and stuff, but basically, like, my family in the U.S. like starts out as just part of the Presbyterian Church USA, which is one of the 7 mainline denominations in the U.S. And what's happened over like basically within the span of a single generation is either we leave the church altogether, which is kind of what I'm kind of in that camp in some ways, or you kind of leave the kind of organized Presbyterian church, and then you find God again through non-denominational churches, which is, I think, the only actual section of American Christianity which is growing compared to the denominational churches. But it's that in itself also has a lot of contradictions because it's like I don't know, like basically it's like the way I see it is like they operate more as evangelicals. Like a lot of my cousins kind of came into the non-denominational thing, and they operate like, I don't know, the way that I see it is like more evangelicals. But even like growing up in a Korean like immigrant church, which at the time was part of the PCUSA, which is what I guess my family's still part of, you could even see like this whole generational thing where like the youth group, you're singing like the modern contemporary like praise songs, like worship songs. But then in adult service, they're the ones who are singing the hymns. And so you can already, even contained within that, there's already the seeds of why all these people end up either leaving the church altogether or going then into like these like kind of much less formal, much less ritualistic forms of trying to like basically find God. And yeah, I don't know, it's been very interesting to kind of observe that, not just from the inside, but also from the outside, because I agree with both of you that like basically it's funny because I'm like much less religious than I was when I was growing up, but in some ways like I'm like much more religious at the same time, because even if I don't go to church anymore, it's like for me, after I became like disillusioned with like Christianity and like the hypocrisy in the church that I saw all the time, and also just kind of like the basic tenets of like this thing of like heaven and hell, this kind of black and white view of the world that either you go to heaven or hell, which didn't really make sense to me. Like really, like after we found, like this tradition of people like King, I was like, oh, this is the only way that the church could save itself, was basically through someone like Martin Luther King. And one of the things that I think is very tragic right now, and it's reflected by like this really sharp decline of all of these denominational churches, is that all of the young people are leaving. And so the church leadership, they try to become relevant by, as you said, taking on the quote unquote progressive social issues. But then that just causes more people to leave, including especially the quote unquote more conservative older people. So then they split from the churches. They form their own like miniature denominations. And so it's like Presbyterian Church USA then splits. So there's Presbyterian Church of America, PCA, which is very conservative. And so you have like all the ads. It becomes very confusing. But the sad thing about it is that although I agree that it's rooted in this basic historical question of America, of American civilization, of slavery, of Black folk, and the color line, the kind of strange, tense thing about it right now is that there's not that like very explicit social issue around which the church has to kind of decide how it's going to relate to. Like you don't have slavery in the United States, right? And yet at the same time, all of the causes of the collapse of these denominational churches and the divisions and the splits comes from that historical problem. And basically it's that the church at this point has no basically sense of mission around which you would have young, like especially young people coming to the churches. And the only sense of mission is this kind of personal thing of, oh, I want to have a relationship with God, which is why the non-denominational churches are growing so fast. But I feel like this sense of mission that I feel like the church should have, which would basically be to, like achieve a new country, to achieve a new American people, it's obscured because like all of the ways that basically like, I don't know, like, it's just not, I just feel like it's not clearly presented to people in the way that you could clearly have in the country also like a clear social issue like slavery or segregation at the time in which the church had to take a stand. But now it's like, it's a lot murkier. And so they tried to be progressive in some things, but then it doesn't really work out and all that stuff. And I don't know exactly, I guess, where to go with that, but it's been, like really interesting to reflect on it both from like a family perspective, because this is something that has taken place within the span of a single generation for immigrants. And I think not just Koreans, but for many different immigrants who come to this country and become Christian. But in a larger sense, like, I feel like a lot of it is that the church, the reason why it can't sustain itself, especially the formal, like the official churches, is that they don't really have a sense of mission anymore. And young people feel that and they respond to it in different ways, and they may not be totally aware of what they're responding to. But I feel like, it's, I don't know, in some ways it's something that like I feel like worried about, I guess, because I'm still invested in it. But it's like for people who are part of like those like mainline denominations and stuff, it's almost like they've been brought to the edge of the abyss, but they don't know what lies beyond it. Like you've been brought to the edge where you see basically your own decline and you see the collapse of the church, but you have nothing. It feels like you have nothing really to take you beyond that point. And the last thing I want to say was related to this thing of the imaginary, because I feel like one of the things that the church does, regardless of whatever church you go to, and also religion, is that this is kind of the basis for what people can imagine. Like, and for me, it's also been very like interesting because it's like I grew up with all this kind of the imagery of the church, the imagery of the chapel, of all of the sacraments, like, all this stuff that you do as a kid that you don't fully understand, but you kind of do. And it is imbued with a lot of meaning, both at the time, but also in retrospect. And I feel like, part of the tragic thing about the white churches is that it's like the imaginary is there, but it's not strong enough to like continue to survive past this period of crisis in American life and American history. And so like, I don't know. I just, part of the question that I have is like, how can we even communicate with people to say like, no, like there is a way out, when like, where it's like, I don't know, like how do you communicate to people that there is a way out, when maybe they see it more as just almost a theological question? Because I feel like that is the natural thing of like, oh, like we're splitting from the church because of a theological disagreement over gay marriage, for instance. But that's not really the substance of it, but they think it's the substance of it. But it's like, like how do you actually talk with people about that?
Well, the other thing that was deep. Okay, well, so I'm also really interested in I've always been interested in the way you grew up, Jeremiah, because you were the first person I met who actually belonged to a denomination. Because like I'm pretty sure, so I had a lot of Chinese Christian friends in high school, but I don't think they were like non-denominational. They just literally called themselves the Chinese Christians. And I was like, what is that? Like what does that mean? Like I don't even know if they, right? Like do they believe in God? I mean, I know they do, but I don't know what theologically that means. But anyway, so I have a lot of Chinese Christian friends, and I'm not sure where they came about or if it was also because of community, but it's also it's interesting getting to know the importance of the history of the different denominations, because, or like even the concept of a main, like what is the mainline Protestant denominations, because I remember when I first read Letter from Birmingham Jail, I was so confused by a lot of basically the religious organizational language. Like I was very, like the only part I knew from that I like connected with was when King said, "I'm disappointed. It's the white moderate is more dangerous than the KKK." But actually, I actually think the message is a lot deeper, because King is, first of all, even the way you describe Doc, SCLC is also King breaking from the National Baptist Convention or Conference. But the other thing is that Letter from a Birmingham Jail is a response to a letter by a bunch of white religious figures. And like I don't know if I'm sure I'm just repeating stuff that everyone else already knows, but to me, it was a revelation to realize that, first of all, it was the Episcopal Diocese of Alabama, the Catholic Diocese of Birmingham, a rabbi from Birmingham, a bishop from the Methodist Church, another bishop from the Methodist Church, another bishop from the Diocese of Alabama, Episcopal Diocese of Alabama, someone from the Presbyterian Church, and then someone from the First Baptist Church of Alabama. And so these are the mainline denominations. And I actually think the deeper part is when King confronts them as Christians, where he says, "I'm disappointed in the white church." And I don't know if it's too much for me to read that section of the letter. So you let me know if I should or not. But it's kind of emotional, because he's also basically saying, how can it be that this faith, which is basically, how can it be that this supposedly shared faith that has driven me to be so courageous, like take up leadership, be the exact thing, like be shared with you who are essentially cowards and going against the faith? Like it's so interesting, or it's actually for me pretty deep, because in some ways what King is saying like, this is actually this is an important part of the heritage, or important part of the life of our people. It is like one of the saving like tools of salvation and freedom for the American people, to be free of white supremacy, which is killing not just Black people, but white people too. Yeah, it's where he says in the letter from Birmingham Jail, he says, let me rush on to mention my other disappointment. I have been disappointed with the white church and its leadership. Of course, there are some notable exceptions. I am not unmindful of the fact that each of you has taken some significant stands on this issue. I commend you, Reverend Stallings, for your Christian stand this past Sunday in welcoming Negroes to your Baptist church worship service on a non-segregated basis. I commend the Catholic leaders of the state for integrating Spring Hill College several years ago. But despite these notable exceptions, I must honestly reiterate that I have been disappointed with the church. I do not say that as one of those negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I say it as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who is nurtured in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true to it as long as the cord of life shall lengthen. I had the strange feeling when I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery several years ago that we would have the support of the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be some of our strongest allies. Instead, some few have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous, and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. In spite of my shattered dreams of the past, I came to Birmingham with the hope that the white religious leadership of this community would see the justice of our cause and with deep moral concern serve as the channel through which our just grievances could get to the power structure. I had hoped that each of you would understand, but again, I have been disappointed. I have heard numerous religious leaders of the South call upon their worshipers to comply with the desegregation decision because it is the law. But I have longed to hear white ministers say, follow this decree because integration is morality, right, and the Negro is your brother. In the midst of blatant injustices inflicted upon the Negro, I have watched white churches stand on the sidelines and merely mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. In the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I have heard so many ministers say, quote, those are social issues which the gospel has nothing to do with. And I have watched so many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion, which made a strange distinction between bodies and souls, the sacred and the secular. There was a time when the church was very powerful. It was during that period that the early Christians rejoiced when they were deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was the thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Wherever the early Christians entered a town, the power structure got disturbed and immediately sought to convict them for being, quote, disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But they went on with the conviction that they were a colony of heaven and had to obey God rather than man. They were small in number, but big in commitment. They were too God intoxicated to be, quote, astronomically intimidated. They brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contest. Things are different now. The contemporary church is so often a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. It is so often the arch supporter of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's often vocal sanction of things as they are. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If the church of today does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authentic ring, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. I meet young people every day whose disappointment with the church has risen to outright disgust. And then he says, I hope the church as a whole will meet the challenge of this decisive hour. But in some ways, it's sad because King is like, it's not really that any different to today. And kind of like what you were saying, Doc, yes, the white church, but also what about the Black church? And the church as a whole, because it's not that people are less Christian, it's not that people are less religious, it's that religion makes people not want to go to church. Like, that thing. And I also think that's why I feel like both those who are religious, but also those on the left misunderstand King when he talks about King, but also Baldwin when they talk about the importance of the intersection of the moral and the political. And how that is where the revolution that's where the revolution really gains traction. But also this thing about this thing about a revolution of values, and why that speaks to the American people so much. And it also speaks to Baldwin's task of achieving the last white nation. That is a political task, but it is also a deeply personal and spiritual and moral task of a people. And yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because I never appreciated the letter from Birmingham Jail, because it's also King talking about the white church, but he's also talking about Christianity and this thing about American civilization's roots in Christianity, or the way it's influenced by Christianity. And it can't be separated. It's that Christianity has to be the people have to deserve, Christianity it's the way Baldwin said, we have to regain the right to worship the Prince of Peace.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Magna. I think what this conversation has also made me reflect on is how, like, what religion means for an oppressed people. Because prior to the free school and prior to really studying King and Baldwin, like, I'd never really understood religion as something like religion as an aspiration of a people who had been oppressed. Because for context, I grew up in a Roman Catholic church, and this was up until the age of 13. And then after I left to go into high school, whatever, I never really looked back because I found no relevance of it to understanding the world, understanding my place in it, except for the fact that Jesus was a good person and you like live morally. But even that was a whole, like, what does that even mean in the society? But I think it is really coming to Philadelphia and understanding what religion, like religion through the lens of King and the civil rights movement, that it also brought a certain humility as well of understanding what religion means to like the poor and working masses of America, where there's something that's extremely important to them, where they see in the life of Jesus and in the life of King um, an example for their lives, and also to believe and act towards a day that will come. And actually, I wanted also to read, like, to add on to what Emily was saying, which is like this dimension of spiritual and moral that Baldwin speaks to in his essay, The Dangerous Road Before Martin Luther King Jr., because he talks about King and he talks about how what he saw when he witnessed King preach. And it's actually really funny because Baldwin himself is such a literary genius, but also such a witty man who can really see people. And I think that's why he writes such great novels and essays. And it speaks to that point, Doc, what you said earlier, which is that you can't really understand the crisis of America without really truly understanding people. And I think that's a fact that people don't actually or underappreciate, which is how much it takes to truly understand people, to understand those around you. And so I'll start like this. I mean, I definitely recommend, like many of us, I think, have read The Dangerous Road Before Martin Luther King Jr. And so I'll start where it says, when King rose to speak, to preach, I began to understand how the atmosphere of this church differed from that of all the other churches I have known. At first, I thought that the great emotional power and authority of the Negro Church was being put to new use, but this is not exactly the case. The Negro Church was playing the same role which it has always played in Negro life, but it acquired a new power. Until Montgomery, the Negro Church, which has always been the place where protest and condemnation could be most vividly articulated, also operated as a kind of sanctuary. The minister who spoke could not hope to effect any objective change in the lives of his hearers, and the people did not expect him to. All they came to find, and all that he could give them, was the sustenance for another day's journey. And this is before King that Baldwin is talking to. Now, King could certainly give his congregation that, but he could also give them something more than that, and he had. It is true that it was they who had begun the struggle of which he was now the symbol and the leader. It is true that it had taken all of their insistence to overcome in him a grave reluctance to stand where he stood now. But it is also true, and it does not happen often, that once he had accepted the place they had prepared for him, their struggle became absolutely indistinguishable from his own, and took over and controlled his life. And what Baldwin essentially is saying is that, because there's a couple of paragraphs prior to this where Baldwin speaks of meeting King for the first time. And Baldwin had all these questions where Baldwin says, I had also many personal questions. And these personal questions aren't of the kind of, gossip gossip specifically in the sense of like tabloids, But he was saying, like, he had so many questions about how a man like King was able to withstand the pressures of leadership, all eyes watching upon him and also waiting for his leadership. And so that's why when he says this, Baldwin is saying that, it was the people that had started this struggle against their oppression, but King had become their leader. And in doing so, King also saw his responsibility to the people. And so Baldwin continues, he suffered with them, and thus he helped them to suffer, or he suffered with them, and thus he helped them to suffer. The joy which filled this church, therefore, was the joy achieved by people who have ceased to delude themselves about an intolerable situation, who have found their prayers for a leader miraculously answered, and who now know that they can change their situation if they will. And surely very few people had ever spoken to them as King spoke. King is a great speaker. The secret of his greatness does not lie in his voice or his presence or his manner, though it has something to do with all these. Nor does it lie in his verbal range or felicity, which are not striking. Nor does he have any capacity for those stunning demagogic flights of the imagination which bring an audience cheering to its feet. The imagination, or the secret, lies, I think, in his intimate knowledge of the people he is addressing, be they black or white, and in the forthrightness with which he speaks of those things which hurt and baffle them. He does not offer any easy comfort, and this keeps his hearers absolutely tense. He allows them their self-respect. Indeed, he insists on it. Quote, "We know," he told them, "that there are many things wrong in the white world, but there are many things wrong in the black world too. We can't keep on blaming the white man. There are many things we must do for ourselves." He suggested what some of these were. Quote, "I know none of you make enough money, but save some of it. And there are some things we've got to face. I know the situation is responsible for a lot of it, but do you know that Negroes are 10% of the population of St. Louis and are responsible for 58% of its crimes? We've got to face that, and we have to do something about our moral standards. And we've got to stop lying to the white man. Every time you let the white man think you think segregation is right, you are cooperating with him in doing evil. The next time," he said, "the white man asks you what you think of segregation, you tell him, 'Mr. Charlie, I think it's wrong, and I wish you'd do something about it by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.'" This brought a wave of laughter, and King smiled too. But he had meant every word he said, and he expected his hearers to act on them. They also expected this of themselves, which is not the usual effect of a sermon, and that they are living up to their expectations no white man in Montgomery will deny. And then, so I think, I read that passage because I've been thinking a lot too recently how we in the free school talk about King as being the father of a new American nation. And it is in these anecdotes of King and the kind of person that you are, someone that's he seems like a giant and can seem so distant at times because he's such a giant. But then you have these moments where he's so funny and, just an average or not an average person, but an ordinary man with fears, but also aspirations. And how Baldwin describes him makes him feel so real too, that I think about what it would mean in these times to even have someone like King to hear his words for our times, because the situation he's describing, where there is a church that isn't adequate for the people, is very similar to what we're talking about right now, which is that people are crying, but there isn't, but it's not being fully answered. And I agree with what Doc was saying earlier, which is that the answers come from this third American Revolution, which is the civil rights movement, but yet has to be fulfilled.
Right. Yeah, I mean, just to add on to that, I feel like the tension with religion, like the fundamentalist versus the, like the whatever, now we're going to include LGBT, but the real answer is interpreting the meaning for our times, which is what King was doing. It's a living, breathing thing. It was created by people. It will be continued by people, and it has a future in human agency. And I feel King really, I mean, it's hard for, like, I think King is a direct continuation of Jesus. He's a direct continuation of these great souls who came to earth to bring us closer to the divine. And that's really how I feel you have to understand him. And, I was trying to explain free school to a friend in Chicago. I was like, yeah, we're rooted in Du Bois, Baldwin, and King. And he's saying, and he's kind of part of the church, the Black church. And he said, oh, you're reading them like how we read scripture. Mm-hmm. And I was just thinking that's such an interesting observation, because it's true in a lot of ways. It really is. I mean, not that we're like, this is the word of God, but it is kind of the word of God, whatever God means, because it's like, it's just this selflessness and love and a continuation of that. And I feel that's also why there hasn't been a good academic treatment of Baldwin, because they don't really hear what he's really saying, and they don't take it they don't put it in their hearts. When you dissect it and analyze it in this, secular way, that's why the secular, that divide doesn't really capture these thinkers. And yeah, I mean, the other thing I just wanted to say about the unraveling of the American church, I completely agree with Jeremiah and Emily and everyone that it's of its own making. It's because it's consigned it. The whiteness is killing the church, really. That's really the big takeaway from what you all have said. But I also feel like it's just, I mean, this is a horrible way to live, without community, without a church, without like, when I first moved to Chicago, I just inadvertently, because I didn't have, I was living the transient life. I was just on my phone the whole day, and it was horrible. I mean, yes, I tried to read, but it's really the will. Like, why would you read that will, that purpose, that community, when that's taken away from you? Like, and that's, most people don't have that because they don't have these communities. And so I do think there is also an elite agenda against the church, or being a part of a church, because it's where people can come together and just be together, at least. I mean, and that being taken away is really horrible. It's really horrible, because it's just an attack on American life. And the way it can come back and be reinvigorated, like Jeremiah was saying, is through a sense of purpose. Like, we come together against an elite. We come together in the name of God and doing right by children, and really peace. Like, that is really the issue that churches have to come together around, like peace, opposition to empire, and which is opposition to racism, and love for Black people. Like, that is really what can revive and renew the church. But it is a long road. But I just think it's not, I mean, on the one hand, it's like, well, this is the logical conclusion of whiteness, just people leaving the church, and, it's splitting up and breaking and dividing. But I think it's also just horrible. And I did not grow up in the church either, but I mean, I do feel that it's also an intellectual place for people. The reading of scripture, which I never realized until I started going to church services. But yeah, I mean, just it's also a form of discipline, and I just feel for people to lose it is very, very tragic. And yeah, I mean, there must be a renewal. I don't think it's not the whole secular thing of saying this is reactionary, give it up, it's horrible.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because well, first of all, it's interesting how Doc laid out, America as a nation and the founding of America being tied up with the Protestant Reformation and perhaps even revolutionary struggles in Europe, in the name of religion. Because one interesting thing about the United States is that compared to other Western countries, the United States population has always been more religious, and particularly since World War II in Western Europe, for example, in most countries, the amount of people that identify as religious is like very, very low. And I think a majority of the Western European countries, or at least in a lot of them, the majority of people are not religious at all, not identify even as Christian anymore in a number of those countries. But in the United States, it's not been like that. Still, it's been quite a religious country among all groups of people. But I saw a poll a while ago that despite that, in the United States, overall religious affiliation is at its lowest ever. Something like, I think approximately 30%, close to 30% of all Americans identify as none when asked for their religion, which is interesting. And I don't really think it's good, like Meghna was saying. I think it's a symptom of the decline of all civil society, basically, and the isolation and atomization of people. Because the thing is, people who are just criticizing organized religion are not really offering an alternative. And as an alternative in terms of organized community and morality, perhaps, like Meghna was saying, maybe in free school we have some kind of alternative to that. But when it comes, it's interesting. Many of the conservatives will say that wokeness is being offered as a new religion, or social justice, quote unquote, is being offered as a new religion. And everyone has to basically adhere to it. Otherwise, you're canceled. In a lot of ways, that mirrors the worst of the medieval church and so on. But I think that it's very interesting how much that's tied up with the United States as a whole. And I definitely think that it is, as Doc said, the framework of American civilization is tied up with Christianity, particularly the Protestant tradition. And the third revolution is very important. And, I'm also personally very astounded by how deeply the intellectual work that a person like Martin Luther King was doing. I mean, for him, I think engaging with Christianity was not just engaging with religion, but engaging with Western civilization.
Yes.
And, the fact that he went through and studied all of Western philosophy, pretty much, all the major post-Enlightenment scholars. Yeah. And then he also studied the anti-colonial struggle. And he studied, and as Doc was saying, African spirituality and so on, and was able to put together a synthesis that could speak to the people. And, like we said, the traditional Marxist lens of just saying religion is the opiate of the people is limited. In a lot of ways, I think we learned from Du Bois and others that religion is also sociological and philosophical. It is a place where the working class and the poor get together and, are socially organized, but also exchange ideas and values. And there is an ideological and philosophical struggle going on over what kinds of values will prevail. And King basically, brought that to the fore. And in a lot of ways, also when you understand religion, like when we're studying the philosophy coming out of the Indian anti-colonial struggle, there was basically a framework that was developed that there are three things basically when it comes to religion. There's devotion, knowledge, and action. And pretty much the major philosophers of the anti-colonial struggle, when they looked at Hinduism or Islam in South Asia, they said that these three things are important, but in the past, our people have neglected action. Our religious clerics have neglected action, the authorities. And what's needed now in the struggle against colonialism, you need to keep devotion and knowledge, religious knowledge, but you need action. And action is tied up with morality. Yeah. And when I see King, he is embodying that in a lot of ways. The thing of you must resist, you must denounce segregation, and you must resist segregation. You must resist the war in Vietnam. And so, of course, I totally agree that is what is needed right now. And there is this tremendous anti-elite feeling that is going on, and you're seeing that in these splits and so on. And I think, again, this concept of civilization is very important. I think civilizationally, to resolve this crisis, you have to go to the third revolution. And a huge part of that was also meeting the world house. You need to, the West has to abandon the kind of arrogance and belief that it can dictate to the rest of the world, which is tied up with some of the negative aspects of the evangelical and other Christian tradition, where I think King was also challenging. Yeah. And I think that and even speaking of religion and the oppressed more generally, one thing I'm very also astounded by when I'm seeing the events in Palestine happening, how much again that resistance is tied up with the religious and moral questions. Obviously, all the Palestinians who are fighting, you see how much they're using religious language and metaphors and many people, especially in the West, are astounded. Like, how can these people offer so many sacrifices? How can a person lose their family and say, you know, Alhamdulillah, all praise due to God for my life and my family's life is all dedicated to the struggle. And you see how that's tied up again with these deep moral and often religious questions. And similarly, the Yemeni forces, you know, who call themselves, the West calls them the Houthis, which is a tribe in Yemen, but they call themselves the Ansar Allah, or servants of God. And they again believe it's their religious and moral duty to stand in solidarity with the Palestinians, even to the point of taking on the United States and the combined West, and the whole overall axis of resistance, which comes out of the Iranian Revolution, which is offering a different kind of anti-colonial theology to the people of West Asia against imperialism and Zionism. And so I think we see in the West, there is a need to return to the roots of the Christian tradition, and especially in the United States, as we've been discussing the Third Revolution. And I think something is going on in the East also, with people grappling with these questions. And the Palestinian situation is where you're seeing a lot of that converge. And I think for humanity as a whole, this is going to be a process that we have to engage with. I mean, this whole question of the Afro-Asiatic reconstitution is not merely a question of the economic rise of Asia or Africa. We're going to have to grapple with these deep moral questions of what kind of future do we want to see, what kind of morality do we want to see. And so there we are going to have to go back to these philosophical questions and engage in this kind of work. And I think it's a good thing that some of it we are seeing unfolding, the actions that are taking place. And I think, as people have been saying, for the American people to participate in this process, we have to go back to this Third Revolution and fully understand the genius that was developed by people like King.
Right.
Can I just add one thing to what Jahan's saying, which is that, interestingly, if you wanted to study dialectical logic and how dialectics in history, you could study the church as an example of that. And in particular, how the Black church and Black Christianity emerged from the contradictions of the overarching American civilizational Christianity. And I think, I don't know, I feel like Baldwin says a lot about that. He's like, when Baldwin is like, what Black people did with Christianity was never intended. And yet we are the only ones who actually redeemed Christianity.
Yeah.
And I don't know, yeah, I just feel like that's part of the blind side, like where the blind spot of so much of the left is like they can't even see their own self-proclaimed like logical reasoning in kind of the historical development of the church. And related to that, interestingly, you know, this thing of, you know, King identifying with the early Christians, right? I think it is very actually the best way that I understand it is analogous to basically this question of the proletariat, because the proletariat is not just a category of an economic relation to production, it's a category of consciousness. So when Marx was talking about the proletariat, he was talking about a laboring class in Europe which was identifying with the ancient Roman proletariat. This is something that I think Danny Jacobs has talked about. And so when Black folk in the civil rights movement and also during Reconstruction, when they're identifying with, let's say, either the early Christians or the slaves in the Exodus narrative, that is an analogous kind of like almost philosophical and a philosophical move that they're making, which is then and kind of speaks to their revolutionary consciousness and revolutionary capacity. But most people on the American left would never see it that way. But it's like, I don't know, even Baldwin, I think, uses that language where he's like, we are like the early Christians running through the catacombs, digging the grave of the Roman Empire. And it's, I don't know, it's kind of amazing to me that people have not seen that that's an analogous kind of radical revolutionary move that Black people made to say we are, you know, this is part of what Doc has talked about with the Black prophetic tradition. Like, we are the people of the book. We are the people about whom the prophecies were spoken. And that's not just them talking about it in a historical sense or even a literary sense, but it's them saying we are a people with a revolutionary capacity. And because also we identify with the narrative of Scripture, this is what gives us a sense of purpose, a sense of destiny, and gives us a sense of faith that actually we can change what seems like an unchangeable situation, and that we can achieve something which has not yet been achieved before. And yeah, I don't know. It's just, like this whole thing of of dialectics, of logic, like so much of it you can study it almost inductively through the church as well, and the development of like basically this new vision of Christianity, and like how Baldwin also says like this New Jerusalem kind of idea. But yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I always think of the East and West, like I think I said this, Rudyard Kipling, the East and West, never the twain shall meet. But Black people have made it. Black Christianity, Black Islam. Those are the terms on which the East and West can meet as equals and friends and co-creators of a new world.
Yeah, I also wanted to add to like what all of you are saying. I think like the framing of how Doc started with like how America as a civilization is framed by Christianity. I was also thinking of in terms of the articles that we were reading and talking about how like religion ultimately is it's an attempt to answer the question of epistemology. And like this is what you were saying, like when we talk about the sort of the popular today's popular critique of religion, the atheists and all of that, it simply comes to a question of rejection of certain facts, but you don't ever talk about a framework with which to approach the truth. And this is, I think, like in one of the articles, I think it was the article on Financial Times on the UUA Church, the Universal Unitarian, and where they talk about like how it was founded on the basis that like this church, the framework of the church was that we are going to prioritize logic and reason over emotional thinking. And then they're I'm like faced with the reality today that now they're saying that okay, logic and reason are these are the white ways of thinking, and therefore we're going to go the other way. And I was thinking that this really speaks to the fact that how we get to the truth is something like it's like there's so much confusion to this question of how we approach the truth. And the framing of this, it really reminded me of how Baldwin talks about when he talks about, I think, the Fire Next Time, where he talks about how how the white framework and white uh essentially the whole European Renaissance, it is rejected by the rest of the world because all of it comes with oppression. And how along with rejecting Coca-Cola and so on, you reject you basically reject European philosophers and so on. And it seems that today it's come to a place where it's white people who are rejecting this whole framework of knowledge, which is a gift not just from or for white people, but for the entire world, for entire humanity. And it's come to this place because you have because it has been used, logic and reason, these have been tools that have been used for colonizing and for slavery. And today you're faced with this dilemma because you don't know a way out of how to get to the truth. And I was thinking how this question is very easily settled by it has always been settled by freedom struggles all over the world. This is how Gandhi talked about the truth. He saw truth as truth in the side of the people. And he wasn't really talking about a majority in that sense, but I think what he was talking about was close to what Du Bois says about the veil, that those who are inside the veil can see the whole world, but those outside can't see what's within the veil. And so the question of truth is settled by where people are at, by where the oppressed are at. And this is really something that's missing from when with this whole confusion with the church comes, in people leaving the congregations, basically disintegrating these hundreds of years of history, and really beautiful history that all these churches have contributed, which makes America in many ways, and by which I mean it makes it unique from the rest of the West. It's really it's really unfortunate and tragic that we are faced we are at this point where the question of epistemology and how you reach the truth is like basically we are at a loss of how to proceed, and we're only stuck with the church in terms we're only stuck with these questions in terms of okay, just one movement. Now let's just talk about the LGBTQ movement, and that's where that's where we disagree. I agree that that's not that's not the main question at hand, but it seems that that's that's the roadblock to to figuring out the new way forward for the church.
Go ahead, man.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Gannon. This is my friend Raya. This is our first time here. We're both Jews, not from Jewish Voices for Peace, just people who are fans of Mr. Montero's work.
Oh,
And, you know, I can definitely relate because in the Jewish community, there's definitely, I personally have been, in turmoil trying to reconcile my faith with my principles and my values. And, I felt lost and hopeless for a long time because so much of our community are, Zionists and elites and people who are, I guess, heretics, people who, I guess, bastardize the values of Judaism. And when I took it upon myself, I know you guys are all Christians. I don't want to make this about Judaism, but
no, most of us are. I mean, we're not all. We're good. I'm sorry.
yeah, okay. I'm still learning, so forgive
Yeah, that's
me.
okay.
But,
No.
yeah, it's just like when I read the scripture for myself, like the Hebrew Bible and even the Talmud, it really, when I saw the text, just in front of me, it really gave me like a profound connection with God that I'd never experienced before, and it made me realize, it made me so confident in what I believe, and I knew it's the universal truth because that's literally what the text says. It's these people go to great lengths to destroy the true teachings of Judaism and Christianity. And yeah, I just think everything that you guys have said is extremely profound and it's deeply touching to me. So thank you all. And Jeremiah Lynn, I'm not sure where you are, but I've read some of your writings and they're fantastic. So I want to applaud you. You inspired me to come out here today.
Really?
What did you read?
Yeah, so just a little background about both of us. Both of us had experience in the, I guess, leftist organizing scene here in Philadelphia. And we quickly realized that our values, we quickly realized that there was something profoundly wrong with what they were doing. And one of the main reasons for me personally was the rejection of the MAGA movement, or just writing them off as like fascists or whatever you want to call them. Because I used to work at a lumber yard here in Philadelphia with mostly proletarian, Philadelphians, people who were Black, Latino, Asian, and they all, were on board with the movement, not because of the rhetoric, but because of the material, like meat and potatoes issues that they were talking about. And while I was in, an organization, I won't say which one, but while I was in this organization, they, rejected me for saying that, because I was just trying to articulate what my coworkers had been telling me, and they're all not like the most educated people, but they can at least are sure in their sensibilities, I guess is the way to put it. So, yeah, when I read your work about that, and I also know Mr. Montero has written about that as well, it gave me a lot of hope. It was a breath of fresh air that people actually, see the things that I thought I was alone in, I guess. So, yeah, thank you for that. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
I guess I just want to say that it's refreshing to hear people talk about this stuff, because like, at least in circles that we've been involved in, like, Marxists are scared to talk about religion. They think it's a bad thing. They think that there's inherently negative connotations to it. They read Marx and their only interpretation is don't even bother with religion, and religious people are deplorable. Like it's just dogma, and they refuse to see it that way, and that's what's very frustrating about it. There's obviously a historical material context to religion that follows throughout all societies, and for some reason they're completely unwilling to even acknowledge it or see it as anything more than just bourgeois rather than a real spiritual crisis. So this conversation has been very sobering.
One more thing I want to add is like we were mentioning dialectics. Like if you want to understand the teachings of Marx, you have Hegel. But if you really want to receive or context for Hegel, you have the Bible, and you have.
That's interesting.
Yeah, like Christian. You know, Christianity is the basis of our civilization, and there wouldn't have been Marx or Hegel without Western civilization, without the very thing that we were founded upon. So yeah, I think exploring this is very important, and yeah.
I wanted to respond to. I'm sorry, I forget the first comrade's name, but there's some men from Camden who knew King, or knew people who knew King, who came to the free school a couple of years ago, and I remember they talked about being more open with conservative Muslims, because as someone who was raised a Muslim in this country, the Muslims that are closest to the working class are more conservative generally, and yeah, I think especially in this moment, like one of the reasons I like the Philly Palestine Coalition protest is because you'll see a lot more families, and you'll see older Arabs, probably from the Northeast, and they have always been sort of the bulk of American Islam, and they still have I guess their Eastern values. They're still influenced by I don't want to call it a social conservatism, but leftists tend to reject them because of that. Like I remember when Meghna and I were part of Philly South Asian collective, and there were people who didn't want to door knock because, as Meghna, it was transformative for Meghna. Their community was problematic, and they didn't want to be exposed to that. But Meghna wanted to go back to the people. And when it comes back to American Islam, a lot of the Muslims who face the worst police repression have been conservative. And actually, if you're conservative, it's a marker for the state to discriminate against you. Like if you have a beard, if you go to Saudi Arabia, if you speak a foreign language. And there's actually a group of political prisoners, the Holy Land Five, who had a charity. They ran a charity in Texas that gave to zakat committees in Gaza, and the United States charged them and broke their constitutional rights because they had a secret Israeli officer who didn't reveal his identity in court testify against them, that this money that they were giving went to Hamas. And yeah, I think there are other names too, like Samuel Arian, and the Al Qaeda cleric who went to Yemen, who Glenn Greenwald, Alwar Nawaki, who was drone striked in Yemen. And when I told those older gentlemen from Camden who wanted to start a freedom school of their own, and I talked about how Anwar al-Awlaki, was killed for his speech by a drone, but also his niece was also killed in Yemen, and also I think his son, who was looking for him in the desert, was also killed by a drone. And it's just like Israel. It's like it's not enough to target the person speaking resistance. They target the whole family. And that's what those men from Camden said. They said that it wasn't just King who was killed. It was his mother and his sister too, in suspicious circumstances. So yeah, I really, that's why I think as someone who was raised in American Islam, I could never just turn my back on someone who had social conservatism, because that's the vast majority of my people.
Yeah,
Just
this oh, sorry, go ahead.
There you go.
Go ahead.
No, I want to know what she has to say. I don't think.
Go ahead, Emily.
Oh, and I was just gonna add another anecdote about, like, I'll never forget when, because I work for a labor union, and there's like there's like basically a worldview or philosophy that the way you appeal to your union members is through, like, thinking that if you just get the crowd riled up around a fair contract, that, like, it's gonna get everyone together. But actually, I'll never forget when I was talking to a Black worker, like this woman who works in a nursing home outside Philly, and she said, when we were talking about what she wanted, like various stickers and things to say, she was like, like, every day, what keeps me going is two people, Jesus Christ and Martin Luther King Jr. And it was that thing where for her, yeah, it's like, it's interesting because I also like to say that despite how much people look down on the white workers from more rural areas for being backwards because they're racist or Trump supporters, actually, like, one of the things that really, like, despite how much people want to say that it's the union that brings the white workers and Black workers together, it's actually the thing that they really have in common is, one, they're all basically been punished by the ruling elite, and they're poor and they know it. But it's also, the other common thing they have is they're all very much religious. Like, they all are, and they all speak in that common language of, like, my mom, like, they'll say, like, my mom taught me to remember, and then they'll say some verse from the Bible I don't know because I didn't grow up religious, and I wish I did so I could understand what they're really saying. But essentially what there is, although they grew up in different churches, like Black church, white church, there is actually now more than ever, I feel, in this crisis, very much a desire from white and Black people, and basically the American people, for, I don't know, to, like, it's people going back to that moral source, like people going back to wanting something better for themselves, like people who don't give up, people who are willing to fight back, because whether they know it or not, there is this foundation in, like, yeah, I guess maybe a Christianity that came from protest, something like that. Because I don't know, that's why I was really struck, because I think people sometimes, for example, let's say the Black worker, like, people think that, oh, the Black worker is revolutionary or stands up to empire because they're a worker. No, it's because it's actually not because they're a worker. It's because they have a certain spirit, a spiritual tradition that has also led to certain struggles, like to be able to say, like Jeremiah was describing, like, I come from the people of the book. I am the people of the book. I am the prophetic people. And yeah, that's why I was really moved when that woman told me, she was like, can you put, because, like, usually when we make stickers, it'll be like, oh, just put the slogan of, like, fair contract now, or we want healthcare. And then this woman was like, I want a sticker that has Martin Luther King Jr.'s face on it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, she was like, I think what drives me is Jesus Christ. Every day I think about Jesus. Like, I think about, what would Jesus say? And what she was saying was that she's like, I don't give up, because I don't give up despite everything in the world that has, like, basically combined against me, because I believe in Jesus and Jesus is my friend. My friend Jesus, that whole phrase of, like, my friend Jesus, like my friend Martin. And yeah, it's just like what this conversation kind of made me think about. Because for, I think, a lot of leftists, or even like union bureaucrats and like politicians, well, I don't know politicians, but you basically, the left, progressives, whatever, to basically look down on religion means you look down on the people, because, like, that is, like, it goes into a lot of the arrogance of people who want to be with the workers but don't even know like who the workers really are in terms of their strivings and spiritual life world and who they are. And I think that's also what's special about James Baldwin, because Baldwin talks a lot about that. Like he even like I was just before Free School, I was reading his essay, like Fly in the Buttermilk or something like that, where he's talking about basically how can it be that a 16-year-old boy can be so courageous to desegregate a high school. And he was talking about where the family and how, and then he was even talking about the principal, the white principal of the high school, and what he thought of the situation. And the way he was investigating who these people are, one, a 16-year-old Black boy, and then his mother, and then this white principal, he talks a lot about their religion. He, especially the white principal, I was really struck that he said, he was like, I know that the white principal is a good person, but he has been lied to. And like, so the white principal said something like, I don't know what I think of the future, but all I know is that I believe in God. And it's kind of different than King, right? The way King, like Alice was reading about King, how Baldwin describes how King makes you feel like, I know the future because I am I know the future because I'm the people of the book and I can change that. But yeah, I know I talked a lot, but yeah.
No, because I was thinking that it's interesting that we're not talking about a totally giving up on church or whatever, because the whole reason why you're bringing up the crisis of legitimacy is because we believe in a real democracy. We believe the strivings of the movement that King initiated, and that still has to be continued. And I do think like it's interesting that we're talking about the crisis of the church as synonymous with the crisis of America,
Right.
in the same vein that we say, well, what does politics have to do with morality or religion? And I see, for me personally, I always had, and this was also something that Jahan was kind of like hinting at too, with like free school and like what it is. But I kind of have to go back to that as a reference point, like what is free school and what has it become in a certain way and where it's going. Because I wasn't interested in politics being in of itself, nor was I interested of knowledge having no reason or purpose that drives knowledge, because I feel like that's why people know in the first place. But either the whole thing about truth, like what is the absolute truth? Like how would you know what is the absolute truth, like you're saying, Sambarta, without a certain grounding of what is good, wrong, and how people interact, like the human historical, like that has to be an aspect of how truth it comes to be known, it reveals itself. But I never thought that the politics and morality were separate, though I think I'm growing to understand how people separate themselves in political engagements because of their own personal, they want to either make money or they want to, and they don't consider what effect, whether that, like I could see, why isn't it a usual thing that we study Baldwin?
Mm-hmm.
It's not that we don't, or that people don't know about Baldwin.
Right.
So why hasn't there been another year of Baldwin, either in 2012 or like 2016, like in these different moments? But we're choosing also because of that urgency of now. Like we know that studying Baldwin is to help this transformative, like, and spiritual, but ultimately, kind of reawaken that core that I think that we're talking about amongst people, which is what Emily was referring to, is that faith that people do have in whether that be the future, or their own vision or their own dreams of what they think that the future they personally deserve. And I think I wanted just to say that because I never saw a difference between politics and morality. Because when you know that, like, it's just it's kind of simple. But I'm only also saying this in the view, or in the kind of like, so for me as an artist, I can't make art without any reason, which is what we're intended to kind of do. And so my first goal was to figure out what was my reason to making it. I can make art, I can make so many things, but for what does it serve? And so my personal journey has to do with this conversation because it's not that as an artist I have to be political, like I'm a political person, but as an artist I do have to take responsibility. You know what I'm saying? Like, and in that sense, why should I fear politics? Why should I fear ideas? Why should I fear the developments of different sciences, or like the discussions about it? Because I feel like my job is also the job, or like I'm walking in step of what we now know, or what I can now articulate of King, which is the making of civilization, the making of a real democracy.
Right.
And so I do agree that a democracy is a very complicated, social and like a political situation, because that means that I would have to acknowledge what we could say the God or the God-likeness in other people, to respect life. It's very that's a very complicated thing, especially coming from this particular historical moment. But how is it also possible? Because I also think that but the connection that King made to the Vietnam War is still in my head. And that's because his morality went beyond than just his reading of the Bible, or his even like the movement of a national movement to free Black people. But it's that connection of that peace at home must consist of also a peace abroad. And that there must be this certain peace, like this the centralization of peace as a mode of conduct, as a way to operate and think through problems and conflicts. And so the thing about politics is that, or like I think that a problem is that when politics people talk about politics, there's a separation between the morality aspect to it, more than it is than politics were always separated from morality. Like I think there's an actual separation of morality in politics. The only reason why you're in politics is because you care about your people, you care about the world, you feel like you're involved. And so there's layers to the degradation of this certain kind of relationship, or like intelligence, like the certain kind of intelligence a person would have towards interacting in society, or in the public sphere, as it were. And that says something about the public intellectual, that says something about the artist for the people, that says something about or even like when we're seeing like a person like Patti LaBelle that we spoke of last week being so. No, I said Patti LaBelle.
Oh, Patti LaBelle.
Being so down to earth to people and like how that's important. Like only that could only be really done if she saw herself as inseparable from the people, and that she was her whole motivation is for the people. She sings to Black people. She, that never was that she never broke from that.
Mm-hmm.
And so like I think that without this I guess understanding that King is in all of us and how he has affected all of us in our generation and in past generations, whether that be in healing towards his death, his assassination, towards understanding how our state operates as imperialist and warlike against the people, or an acceptance of a certain responsibility of that knowledge. And I do think that people have faith. And I think that I'm thinking about how, like, I do see that the Black vote is moving from, like, the Democratic Party and from Biden towards the Republican Party and those kinds of conversations. But I'm also wondering, because this is the same question for me, like, or like that we have talked about before, do Black people still have what it takes?
Yeah.
Right? And that's not to say that they don't, because this whole conversation is to explain why they do.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it is, or at least I'm gonna continue to keep an eye on, or as we always do, continue to keep an eye on the moves that in this particular country Black people will have to choose. And what is interesting is that we're saying that, it's not just a thing of like Black people, because white and Black people are both in this, but it is a matter of this moral choice that we still are not striving to be an elite. We're not striving to be, less than what we deserve, to say the least. But I think that it's possible, maybe now more than ever, to go back to these sources. And I think now's the time more than ever to go back to these sources of Baldwin and King, to recenter what maybe we already know about ourselves.
Emily, do we have any comments that we'd like to read?
Yeah, we have a bunch. Wait, Alice, did you want to read them or you want me to read them?
Sure, I can read them. So I'll start from the morning. Todd, Neha, BK, Susan, Jake all say good morning and Merry Christmas. Susan in particular says, hello to speaker in Boston from listener in Boston. So that's to you, Emily. Todd responds, I was raised in Brockton and Norwood. My parents now are in Marblehead. This is to Susan. Doc, earlier when you were talking about the Protestant Reformation, Don DeBar says on October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther posted his 95 Thesis on the door of the church at Wittenberg, Germany. Add Christopher, who also says good morning to everyone. Jerome speaks a little bit more about the Quakers. I wrote some years ago, should be online, about that Quaker demonstration, included photos of the demonstration location. Later, he adds an anecdote, but he says, if you tell anyone, I'll deny it. But an old friend was a Black Quaker, and every year I would attend. They had a conference on the different Black college campus. Also, George Fox, founder of the Society of Friends in England, recorded that in 1650, Justice Bennet of Derby first called us Quakers because we bid them tremble at the word of God, end quote. Then Jerome says, it is likely that the name, originally derisive, became their name. Don DeBar responds to the business model. He says it's a bullshit model. That is a popular model and not just in religion. Being business and making money, operations is something that is both prominent in religion, but also in other institutions. BK says, great observations, and adds, in my humble opinion, it's not enough to just subscribe to a religious label or doctrine and dogmatically follow the rituals with no true understanding. Many begin to identify with the religious label and feel it is prohibited to examine other religious doctrines. But through objective examination of all religions, a common source is apparent. Todd adds, hope and fear are what make all of us human. Responding to, I believe this was Jahan earlier, about devotion, knowledge, and action. Wow, action is so lacking. And I think Blaze adds, my friend Jesus, the cosmic companion. And lastly, BK says, faith without works is dead. So that's all we have from the comments.
The other thing I wanted to mention was that, like Jeremiah was saying that, well, there isn't any, okay, I might be wrong in how I heard Jeremiah, but there isn't like segregation that the church or churches need to stand against. But I also can't imagine a church with like at this time, churches need to stand with people, like Alice was saying earlier, like people are crying, like in this time where opioids are rampant, you know, I can see how people would need somebody honest to be like, I need to help heal. I need this to be thought through so I can have a way to see what can be my future without all of this. I need answers, like, you know what I'm saying? And, or even with this thing, with gun violence, or like everything that goes on in a way that's been able to be dealt with in all the streets of Philadelphia. And people are still either holding on, like Emily was saying, in that personal, like, I know Jesus is my friend. But then what of, like what Magda was saying, of a church that aren't just bells and whistles, like a church that isn't just in pockets with City Hall, or like a church, like, and I mean by the church, I mean also by its leadership, because, or even with the Democratic Party, like what then, like you make perverse the church, but you're actually making a hypocrite kind of your own self to the people that people can obviously see. So then it's a choice. Do the people capitulate? Is there a way out? Do we just shortcut it? And I think that when we're saying, when we're declaring like a year of Baldwin, we're saying no more shortcuts, no more like roundabout, you know, back way, no dead end, you know, trips. Let's go right to the heart of what can save the moral conscious and make real our decision towards our future, to have and be able to hold that in our hands and not be so weighed down by, you know, because it's so interesting seeing white people in Philly and how Black they are, and then how what would make of that person, you know what I'm saying? Like, whether that be it's not just poverty, but it's the moral degradation of poverty. And whether we go back to slavery because of that, or we can also connect that to what I said prior about the opioids. And besides, it seems like, I mean, at least I'm reminded about the trips that you guys made down to like Memphis or whatever to like see Fisk and stuff, and how you guys felt of the South. And while I do know that the South holds, and this is a simple way to say something complicated, meaning it's not as direct as I want it to be, but holds civilization, what a depth, or like what a lack of like if the South is in disarray, you know what I'm saying, then what makes of America? Like, what of every city, and majority Black city or inner city, like what is the moral fiber that makes up America? And I think that it has everything to do with our political capabilities, meaning our analysis. It has everything to do with how we like know, like when you're saying, Sambarta, like that really clicked with me, because knowing is very important in a time of crisis, plain and simple. But then it's the practice, meaning like the re-education of your own person. And you know, all this talk about ADHD, or even like, because this is just conversations, or just it's not solely just about the attention, but why would somebody pay attention to something and for what reason? So, you know, rather than make it like, oh, we'll do quick bits, we'll make shorter videos, or even more short to fit. Why not then backtrack and try and have a discussion, or even make it more about how to slow down to pay attention, rather than to speed up and like catch up maybe with something that doesn't exist, which is either like which is what we're saying about whiteness, the lie that the world is in peace and that everybody is comfortable and we can just go to our jobs and have our families. Like, no, first, we can't actually even raise children without dealing with what our country now has become and could become quite quickly if we don't decide upon how we stand on war and peace.
Right.
Or like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's the time that we're in is much more desperate, and everybody also knows that, but it's like a thing where, but then when it comes to that point of knowing what time that you're in, it's about what you do with that knowledge. Are we going to maintain? Are we supposed to just kind of be satisfied in a certain level of materiality and kind of comfort? Or is it about, again, what do we see as our options for the future? And so that's what I was thinking about when Jeremiah said, yet there's not that right in your face decision about racism, but actually in this time it is this distinct decision of which is the outgrowth of racism. And that's the poverty of the spirit, the war against human beings between each other, Black and white, or even the degradation of the family and home. Like, that all has to do with racism, because racism is dependent upon a singular person not knowing that, or not saying to themselves that another person is a human being, and thus hating that person,
Mhm.
what does that, and this is Baldwin, what does that then do to you?
Mhm.
You know?
Mhm.
And so,
Mhm.
like,
Mhm.
that's also what I mean. It went about like bringing up this conversation now. It's that the church does have a moral choice to make.
Mhm.
And it's not like we're saying about the LGBTQ,
Mhm. Mhm.
but it's about the literal fabric of this
Mhm. Mhm.
civilization.
Mhm.
And that's why we have to go back to Cain. All churches.
I just want to build upon what Serafina was saying, because the articles are misleading. There's something obviously, both articles say that there's splits in United Methodism and in Unitarian Universalism based on the LGBTQ controversy. I don't think that's true at all. I think the deeper thing is what you are saying. But then there's even another level of this. And the question that any moral person, any religious person would ask to churches, and this is black and white, why have you all been so silent about what's going on in Gaza? Why aren't you all saying that every child in Gaza is our child, is my child, is my grandchild? I mean, you can go around this city. It's like business as usual.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about black churches. In fact, I heard, well, I don't know whether I heard this, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were not groups of black ministers. And this indicates how far we are from Martin Luther King, or how we resist Martin Luther King. I have not heard a group of black ministers in this city or anywhere else come out and condemn Biden and Netanyahu for these crimes against, they say, humanity, which is the same as saying crimes against human civilization. This is a civilization war, and there's nothing been said. The Unitarians haven't said a damn thing. I don't expect much of the Episcopalians. They could take that whatever way they want. You know what I'm saying? They can close the doors to us. You know? Can I just say something? The pettiness of what goes on in churches, the pettiness, and sometimes to go into a church is to expect to be insulted, to be humiliated, to be told you're not following protocol when nobody informed you of a protocol. Any way to silence people and to continue business as usual. This is the disgrace. Not what your position on the LGBTQ question is. And I agree. These are wars against civilization. And I agree with you 200%. The regime in Israel is not a Jewish government. It has nothing to do with biblical or ancient Judaism. Nothing. It is, in all essentials, a Nazi regime waging a war against human civilization, which they want to say is a war against Islamic extremism. I agree with you very much, Jahan. In the Houthis or Hamas or Hezbollah, standing up in the name of God is a way of standing up for humanity because they believe that God is in each of us.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And for them to, who can stand by and watch children murdered intentionally? This is not accidental. And then go to church. No. And even our colleagues are not members of Jewish Voices for Peace. Thank God for Jewish Voices for Peace. Because that's the Hasidim, because that's the only thing that is preventing the whole world from denouncing Judaism or what goes for Judaism. I mean, I think the fate of the Jewish people, 16 million in a world of 8 billion. You can't buy your way out of this. You can't do it. I don't give a fuck how much money you got. Oh, we're not going to give no money to Harvard. So what? We're not going to give to the university. You can't buy your way out of it.
And
the only way out is for the moral reclaiming of Judaism and of the Jewish people. But that goes for Black folk.
Yep.
I am so dissatisfied with the Black church and this business model, this transactional model. Everything you got to pay for. When the church, these churches have these huge endowments, why everything got to be paid? Give it up for free. Do something that people don't have to pay for. But that's just the transactional model. Has if Johanna, anybody, if you have heard where the Episcopal Church in the United States has spoken about what's going on in Gaza, has the Unitarian Church, have the Baptists, have the Methodists. Well, you got the Christian Zionists, which itself is a fraud.
Yeah, right.
The question is not whether Christians are united with Zionists, but whether Christians and Jews are united on a single purpose. The Zionists are not Judaism.
Right.
But anyway, I mean, and so the articles, of course, New York Times and Financial Times, what can you expect of them? But this idea that, it's over a popular cultural, no, it's deeper than that. And it goes, I agree with you, Sarah, it goes back to the beginning of the country. And it's manifesting at this time. And this is horrible. I don't know how we can make it through, how the country can be saved unless the values of civilization and ancient civilization, including the people of the Abrahamic religions, are restored to the life world of modern nations. Can't do it. But that's all I have to say.
No, but I think that's part of what's kind of being worked out in this time. Like we talked about it last week too, and how, like, I was thinking that King is not just the father of a new nation, but like a father of a new epoch. And but in the fact of when you say that, like the civilizational state, when we talk about that in China. But also what I saw in what Jahan was saying about the, like, even if 14 members of your family had died, it's still alhamdulillah. Like, I see that as the same thing that the sit-in movement were capable, and the people a part of the sit-in movement and the desegregation in general were doing. They said, well, I am, like, this is me, like I'm, like God is in me, right?
They did.
That's
what they said.
So then it comes to the question, a difference between Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. It's just a matter of its historical development based on this period of struggle.
That's right.
Like this period of struggle.
And it's ongoing. So,
right.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you. But it's ongoing because we now have to redo those same ancient struggles where Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they were not seen as enemies.
Enemies, right.
They were seen as part of the same thing.
Right.
And they lived as one in Western Asia.
Yeah.
So how the fuck did we get to this? And how do we get back to that?
Right.
Not that we'll live, but back to
Right.
that in this
in
moment, in this
modern-
new epoch.
And also into the
Yes.
future.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is the only way to really save it. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And I think that knowledge is known by millions of people, just like Emily talked about her coworker. I think of what Jesus would say. What you have to get to under what she's saying.
Right. And back
Mhm.
to like
Yes.
in my mind, what just popped up was Paul Robeson and his languages, right?
Yes, yes.
Because you can't
Yes.
understand languages without a moral like obligation to other people and empathy towards human beings. Like I thought that's what his investigations and also what he revealed to our time, which is because I think it's a thing where Americans are like only taught English and like, you know, you have Baldwin and he's like, well, Black English is a dishonest language, like, or I'm butchering the title, but he has essays on English. And there's a lot of, you know, people talk about the English language and how it's used and stuff like that. That's a whole conversation. But with Paul Robeson, he was also saying like, I see the origins or I see some similarities within like languages of Asia because of Africa and like how it rooted itself in Africa. And like what that reveals is something scientific true. And it comes to question of like, you know, what is beginning, like where does language, how does it develop? There's a whole, you know, whole studies could be done on that alone. But what it also revealed to me in a very basic sense was that there's just a way to understand people literally through how you empathize or can relate to other people. Like and then it comes to a conversation of how one is thinking, whether they think in images or, you know, so it's like it's a whole development to the human, you know, being. Because what you're saying about this synthesis of religions or this Afro-Asiatic reconstitution, like that all, yeah, like that all can produce what we're saying, like when we see in the Nation of Islam, like in the Asiatic Black man and that whole spiel that comes with that. And you're not the only Jewish person here because I am too. But
interesting, isn't it?
Because I just reviewed it, I was just like spiel, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. So
you revealed yourself.
I did. I was like, oops. No, but like that's also the thing about, or the kind of interesting question about America too, because we are this what is it? The pot, the boiling, melting pot. You know what I'm saying? But like, so the possibilities are endless if we're able to make this kind of moral choice, and I think that precedes everything.
This is very interesting. Can I just say, and I know we don't have a lot of time because you know we have to, but can I just say one thing apropos the left and how they don't understand what time of day we're living in. It's like King said, and we perhaps should reference or read that sometime. What does it mean to sleep through a great revolution? And in effect, that's the way I feel, you know, having come out of the left, when the left was the, you know, you paid a cost for being in the left, you know. Yeah, that where, but most of the left is asleep through a great revolution. And it's so interesting, you know, in the communist movement, the world communist movement, it was argued that the Russian Revolution constituted not just a revolution, but the beginning of a new epoch, you know, of the rapid movement forward towards freedom of the proletariat, of colonial oppressed people, of racially oppressed people. Now think about it. Marx completes the first volume of Das Kapital in 1867. The Russian Revolution is in 1917. So 1867 to 1907 is 40 years. 1907 to 1917 is another 10 years. So we're talking about 50 years from the completion of Das Kapital to the Russian Revolution. And I accept the statement, the beginning of a new epoch. Well, 60 years ago, there was the Great March on Washington, etc. What is so hard to grasp about our having entered a new epoch? By a new epoch, we mean new revolutionary possibilities, new possibilities for freedom. But that every people will find their own path based upon how the people, like the American people, have been formed as a people out of a history. And that's what Baldwin is all saying. Whether we recognize each other or not, we are part of a fabric born out of a single history, born in an epoch, in a moment. Now we're entering another epoch with new revolutionary possibilities. But the path forward will not be as it was. It will be based upon the newness of this time. Now, my last point. You get it in Vladimir Putin, although I don't quite agree with everything how he puts it. But this idea that going forward, that nations will not be just nations, they will be civilizations. States will not just be states, they will be civilization states. Well, Vladimir Putin, I think to get it, to flesh it out, I would recommend to you James Baldwin and Martin Luther King Jr. You know what I'm saying? He's anchored Putin to the Russian Orthodox Church. But there's something bigger than that. And that is, I think, Protestantism and then its intersection with Islam and Judaism. And I think maybe the American people will be the petri dish, the laboratory for the rest of the world. So I just wanted to say that.
I agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Emily, I know it's 2 o'clock, and I know
I gotta go.
Serafina got to go. She got to go.
Okay. Well, that was a great discussion this week. We'll end here with America being the petri dish for the world, which I also agree with. And hope everyone has a safe holidays. And I think we're going to be on live stream next week, but we'll keep you updated on that. But thanks everyone for joining, especially in the comments, and our visitors at Doc's house. It was so nice to meet you guys. So bye.
Merry Christmas.